Okay, welcome back to part 2 of our discussion of methods of instruction, our little introductory video. We're touching in kind of a shallow introductory way about some of these methods, then we'll go deeper as we go further into this course. In the first video, we discussed direct instruction, lecture, a type of instruction, and we also talked a little bit about learning theory and ideologies. Right now, I'm going to talk some more about more interactive, playful forms of instruction. I was about to use the word fun, but I realized in the back of my head, sometimes fun can be a dirty word in instructional context. I want to wipe that out. I want you to think that it is okay for students to have fun. There's nothing wrong with fun at all. In fact, fun is an emotional response that leaves you more receptive to what's happening. Your memory can improve with fun. There's nothing wrong with positive emotion. Allow your students to experience positive emotions. Remember, negative emotion, stress, toxicity, that blocks learning. Positive emotions leave you more receptive to learning. It's okay for students to enjoy themselves. It's okay for students to smile. It's okay for you to smile too. Obviously, I'm sitting here in my one-bedroom apartment as I make this video. It's COVID-19. So if I'm not smiling right now as much as I'd like to, as I'm modeling the idea of fun, I mean, here I am. I'm talking about the idea of fun. I'm not so sure that I'm modeling it either. But remember, when you're talking with your students, bring your A game, even if you're tired. Allow your students to have fun, even if it's the 100th time that you've taught this lesson. Allow your students to enjoy it, even if you've taught the lesson so many times that honestly speaking, you're bored with the topic. You don't want your students to be bored. So with interactive instruction, give a priority to relationships, partnerships, role play, group activity. I'm going to break this down for just a moment here for you. We talk about groups. The way that you group your students needs to vary depending on your purpose for why and how you're choosing these groups. I hear the question being asked all the time, should I group homogeneously, heterogeneously? Should I group by gender? Should I group by ability level? Which do you recommend? You go out there on social media where teachers are congregating on social media. That's a common question. And then you've just got one person will ask that post, how should I group students? Then you've got a bunch of people without knowing anything else but the question, giving their responses. I prefer to group it this way. I prefer to group it that way. My answer is yes, depending on the context and the situation, the goal. If your goal is relational in terms of just simply play and have fun and be with friends, then group by friends. That's okay. If your goal is to study a concept deeply and to learn a concept deeply, then group it as if you are an instructor and as if your students will be instructors. That means heterogeneous ability. That means more expert learners instructing less expert learners. But be careful here. You don't want a situation in which the same student will always be the more expert learner. Because yes, we benefit from teaching, yes, we learn from teaching, but it needs to be varied. Sometimes that more expert student needs to be in a group where that student becomes less expert and is learning from someone. So vary the groups a little bit. But remember, if you're talking about it from a socio-cultural point of view, socio-cultural learning theory draws on Vygotsky. You can tell I mentioned that name a lot. If you read some of my work, some of my writings, you'll find that I draw on Vygotsky a lot. In fact, at my old university, Aristotle State University, before I came to University of Arkansas, Little Rock, in a joking sort of way, sometimes people would call me Dr. Vygotsky, just because I would drop that name in terms of citing what I said so much. Obviously, my name is not that, but that's another story. But here's an important thing that I want you to learn is that, yes, heterogeneity matters. Yes, we learn from more expert others. That's a very important part of learning theory in the sociocultural sense. But there's a mistake that teachers often make. And it amazes me that we make that mistake. We will send students out there to help and tutor fellow students or to work in groups with other students. We haven't taken the opportunity to train our students in methods of instruction, methods of teaching, pedagogy. Think about it for a moment. As a current or pre-service teacher, what do? 2 years of content area training, followed by, at the undergrad level, approximately 2 years of classwork in methods of instruction, your methods of teaching English, methods of teaching social studies, methods of teaching second language learners, methods of writing instruction, content area literacy instruction, which should include methods of instruction too, classroom assessment methods, all this methods. Whether the word methods is in the title of the course or not, it should include pedagogical methods. And your university professor should be well versed in approaches to teaching methods and pedagogy. And then after that, you get a master's degree in order to be a more expert teacher. Master's degree basically says, hey, I know what I'm doing at a level that's beyond the undergrad level. I have a level of expertise here. That's 2 to 3 years of training, again, in methods work, the theory as well as the practice, the why as well as the how at a fairly deep level, or at least it should be deep. Then PhD. A PhD is, of course, a research degree, but it should include the how too. As a professor of these courses that you take from me, absolutely I am expected to know educational theory and philosophy and methods of research, of course. But if I'm training you to be a better teacher, or to be a practicing teacher, to become a teacher, depending on what level you're taking me as a teacher, I better darn well know how to teach. And I would argue that university professors better darn well have experience as K through 12 classroom teachers themselves. Otherwise, all you're doing is you're talking about something abstract to you if you haven't actually done it. It's all theory. It's all in your head if you haven't actually done it. And yet we don't impart training to our students when we send them out to work in groups. What do you think that message that's sending, and what's going through our own minds? Because we say all the time we value our own training and that teaching is a profession, not just a craft. So if it is a profession, which I would agree 100%, 1000% that it is, then let's also, if we're going to turn our students into makeshift teachers, let's make sure that they know how to teach in a basic way. How do you scaffold learning? How do you do a think aloud? How do you model for your peers? How do you give effective feedback in a way that doesn't accidentally cross the line into a microaggression or an insult? What are your tones of voices that you want to take? What's the difference between open gestures and closed, open gestures and closed off gestures, all of that stuff matters. Because if we ignore it, we're ignoring the importance of peers learning from peers. Here's the thing. Learning is an emotional process as well as a cognitive process. Students are by nature receptive to learning from their peers. Sometimes they will learn better from their peers than they will from you as a teacher, just simply because of the emotional connection that is present. But it absolutely helps if the more expert peer knows how to teach in a basic rudimentary way. Role play. I want to highlight role play for a second here. Oftentimes when we think role play, we're thinking about role play as it tends to exist at the early childhood and elementary level. Vygotsky, who studied young children a great deal, highlighted role play, pretend role play, pretending that you're taking on the identity of something else or someone else, as one great imaginative leap that we take in our cognitive reasoning. It's a major leap forward. It's a step forward in our cognitive reasoning. So Vygotsky has a lot to say for young children about imaginative role play, but for right now, I want to focus more on middle secondary. I want to highlight the importance that if your students are studying, let's say, an English literature course, they're studying literature in an English course, prepare students with the knowledge of what it means to take on the role of literary scholars. Prepare students with the knowledge of what techniques are used, what methods of inquiry are used. That means, of course, you need to be aware of it too. You need to study it. You might need to look some things up because not all of us are expert at every job there is in the field. There are times I need to look things up. I'm not an expert on everything. What's wrong with admitting that? So if you look up the work of Bruner, for instance, Jerome Bruner, you'll find that he had a lot to say of the value of students taking on the roles of professionals in a field. If they're going to be learning science, for instance, take on the makeshift identity as well as the techniques of real scientists. You're going to study geography, take on the techniques, the methods of inquiry, the identities of geography. If you're going to be a physicist, take on the identity of and the practices, the techniques, in at least a makeshift way, to the extent that students can do it, at their ability level of a physicist. Maybe not with a moon math that physicists are capable of, but you get what I mean. Okay, so you also notice that I talk about community here. I'm an advocate of what Barbara Rogoff would call the community of learners concept, if you want to look up Rogoff. Now, think about what it means to be a community. That means common goals, common understandings, common sense of values, ethos, a way of understanding what it means to be we instead of separate, right? E pluribus unum, if you will. So in a classroom, your classroom comes from people of profoundly diverse backgrounds, but it can be a community too. A makeshift community for that limited period of time that students are there. Each day that they walk in, the community is formed again, formed anew. That takes time to develop. It doesn't happen from day one. Think about the things that make communities become dysfunctional. Think about why wars start, by analogy here. Think about why there are civil wars for power. Think about what causes strife. That's an analogy of what you want to avoid in a community. But if your community is a true community within this classroom, it will benefit learning tremendously. Okay, I'm going to shift now to the instruction of second language learners. Now, total physical response that I'll talk about for a little while is not limited to instruction of second language learners. And in fact, this is a technique that can be used with all learners in general language classrooms and across content areas. But for the purpose of this brief overview, I'm going to focus on the instruction of vocabulary to second language learners just for this purpose. But if you study total physical response, you'll find that it is used in various contexts too. Please, again, make sure when you get this PowerPoint, obviously you can't click on the links from a video, but when you get the physical PowerPoint, please watch the videos that I'm putting in here so that you will see total physical response in action, not just described. Total physical response is a way, just like the name sounds, of connecting the new vocabulary word or concept that you're learning with physical movement and dialogue and discourse in a way that makes use of the idea that as we activate our body in physiological ways and as we make sense of learning in multi-sensory ways, it helps us learn that concept more deeply in a more nuanced way. You combine direct as well as indirect instruction. Typically speaking, start with direct instruction, go to indirect, then you might have a review with direct instruction. It's both conversational, dialogic, as well as active for the students. Okay, preparation is profoundly important. I never recommend that you leap into total physical response without having a plan first, especially as a new teacher or an inexperienced teacher. Now, people who have been doing the total physical response technique for years and years and years, yeah, they might be able to spur the moment like that. I'm not very good at snapping my fingers, but you get the point. They might be able to spur the moment, leap into a total physical response activity without planning. But that takes time, takes expertise. Make sure that you're, as you can see, well prepared. Make sure that you gather everything in advance. Think of what props, physical objects, such as if you're talking about a vocabulary, maybe an object that is representative of a vocabulary or concept in a very real way from a student's culture. That's called realia. Gather that in advance. Okay, so here I'll take you step by step through the process of total physical response in a nutshell. And of course, again, make sure that you watch those links that I have embedded so that you can see total physical response in action. You start as a teacher by saying the new word for the students. As you do this, use facial expressions or physical gestures um, or props that you might bring in, and movement to help illustrate and bring meaning to what this word means, what it represents, concepts behind the word, history behind the word. Allow the student to see you mentally playing with this word, this concept in ways that are interesting. It's notice how already, just by doing that, you've made the word a lot more interesting than just simply giving students a bunch of words on a ditto sheet with a dictionary definition and asking them to memorize it. Already we're beyond that step. Next step is the student. But before I go into the student, I want to go back to this thing with the teacher. Before I go into the student, because there's something I almost forgot to say that I wanted to say very carefully. When you are saying the words to second language learners, there's a very, very fine line, a balancing act that I want you to make sure that you watch. On the one hand, you want to make sure that your pronunciation is very clear, very exact, especially if the students are learning this word from you, because students need to know how to pronounce this word. They're very curious about how to pronounce this word, ideally. So yeah, slow down, be exact, think about your pronunciation, think about your accent, be self-reflective even about your own background and your own accent that might make it a little bit difficult for students. For instance, take me. I'm aware that there are ways that sometimes I pronounce words in, shall we say, a way that has an interesting dialect to it. I'm aware that sometimes it can hinder people from understanding me. I've sometimes had a tendency to talk too fast, especially in face-to-face instruction. Sometimes students have had to, in my college classes, have had to ask me to slow down if I start talking a little bit too fast, and that's okay. When you're speaking the second language, think about your pace. With my own background, think for a moment. In part one of this video, I talked about my own background. I've lived in, where all at this point? Pittsburgh, Idaho, Oregon, back to Pittsburgh, Florida, South Carolina, Missouri, Arkansas. My gosh, talk about all these influences on the way that I talk that have seeped into me. And people ask me about why I talk the way I talk. There is no one in my family that talks the way I do. My parents don't talk like I talk. People think I sound like I have a British accent or a German accent sometimes. And yes, with the 23andMe thing, not to promote that side, it could be any side, but I'll be honest, I used that at the request of my wife. 50% of my ancestry is British-Irish by background, by origin. So yeah, I think that influences my way of talking. But all of those other influences from all these other places that I've lived influence me too. Talk about a mishmash of dialects that influence me. I don't talk like any one of these single places. I don't talk like a Pittsburghienser. And hopefully anyone from Pittsburgh will get that I mean that with love and humor. I don't talk like a Missouri person. I don't use the word Missouri. I talk like me. Now think for a moment about yourself, your own background, where you've lived, what has influenced you. There may be ways in which your way of talking isn't as easy for a second language learner as you assume that it would be. That's very important. But, so that's the one hand. There's another hand too. Be careful about this. Don't slow down too much. Don't raise your volume too high. Don't over exaggerate your facial gestures and your body gestures to such a point where you commit a microaggression, where you insult the person. Be very careful. Because here's the thing, and it's something that my wife is a second language learner, born and raised in China, but that's what we've talked about this a lot. But here's the thing, is that people who are second language learners oftentimes encounter others who are whose native language is English. There might be, without even intending to do it, a little stare, a long stare. There might be brief laughter. There might be slowing down too much, raising the voice too loud, repeating the word over and over again, even when it's not necessary to repeat. An exaggeration from a movie clip that I'll give to use hyperbole here. We've all seen the meme in the movie Rush Hour, the old movie Rush Hour, where Jackie Chan is getting off a plane and his police partner says to him in this really exaggerated way, "Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?" If you're not familiar with the meme, you can look it up, but I'm not a fan of the meme because, yes, people use it in all kinds of ways. They don't think about the context that this is someone from, in Jackie Chan, the character as well as the real life person, is from China, speaks English pretty darn well, perfectly well. But then the assumption, the stereotypical assumption was raised voice, slowing down, do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? Microaggression in a hyperbolic way in this movie scene. Insult. Frankly, I'll use the word racist. That meme that gets passed around, do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? It's a racist meme. Because here's the thing about racism. It's not the intent that matters. When someone does something that is a microaggression with racial overtones, ethnic overtones, etc., I frankly don't care about, oh, I'm not a racist, or that's not what I intended, or all that stuff. I don't care. It's not your intent that matters. It's the effect that matters. Racism has strong overlays of power, of harm. Remember, teachers are in power. We, by nature, are holding power over our students. That's the name of the game. We hold the power of the grade book and so forth. So I really don't care what your intent was. Make sure that you think about the effect. Okay, from here we get into the student. So remember, in terms of these steps with total physical response, first comes the teacher, next the student. Make sure that the student is a volunteer, because if you just simply call on students at random to be volunteers, so many times when I see teachers doing this, they'll even use this as a threat. Okay, if no one raises their hand and volunteer, I'll pick on someone. What does the word pick on mean? That has overtones of bullying, doesn't it? Hypothetically, if you aren't having a student be a volunteer, then a student might be resistant. They might make mistakes in front of the group. in terms of modeling how to say this word, using the facial gestures. There might be a sense of anger, embarrassment. Suddenly, you've taken a student in your class and you've created that student into potentially a wounded student and potentially into a resistant learner, all in that one move of not seeking volunteers. And then what's the next thing you're going to do? That student is going to tune out. That student is going to make bad grades, possibly act out in a negative way. Possibly there'll be a parent-teacher conference. The student will be in trouble. The teacher won't say I did anything wrong. In fact, the teacher might not even realize it. Because again, intent, the teacher might be thinking all about intent, and intent doesn't matter right now. The teacher, I'm sure in this scenario I'm playing out for you, the teacher had zero harmful intent, but the effect was harmful. That's why it's important to seek out volunteers in this step 2 that I'm talking about. So once you do have a willing volunteer, confident volunteer, just as everything that you just did to say the word, use gestures, props to help that student, your group of second language learners understand the word, your volunteer does that too, just like you did. So that's step 2. Step 3 is as a group, your students as a group now do everything that you originally did. The same gestures, the same vocal tone, the same body movements. That's what this group of students do too. So that's step 3. Step 4, we get into writing. It can be as simple as you writing the word or phrase on the board. Obviously, these days we've got different forms of board. I've been in really nice classrooms and schools where you've got the electronic device that the teacher can write on by hand and it appears overhead for students. That's wonderful. I love it because that saves the situation of the teacher physically walking over the board, turning their back to the class. I love it. Technology is wonderful in that way. But whatever your situation, I hope that you have that advantage, but you might not, depending on the funding to the particular school in which you teach. But the bottom line is you write the word or phrase on the board so students can see it. And again, you might pronounce it a new way, model it a new way as you're writing it, and help students visually connect the oral with the writing. Notice what's going on. And behind the learning theory behind total physical response is, of course, multisensory learning. The idea that we learn concepts, words, more deeply in a more nuanced way that's more connective within our schema theory and our long-term memory. Remember, I'm a believer in a networked approach to schema theory and long-term memory. So I really believe that connections matter and that multisensory connections matter if our schemas within our brain are connected, distributed like that. So these multisensory connections help students learn the word in a deeper, richer way. Repetition and practice matters when it comes to total physical response. So again, have students repeat, have students do it multiple times, and don't be afraid 3 weeks later after you've gone on to new words to bring back an old word from 3 weeks ago back so that it isn't forgotten. And you can do total physical response in multiple ways, including total physical response circles as described here. You can also do total physical response Simon Says. You can toss a beanbag around as a total physical response is done, repeating the word while tossing a beanbag around. There's so many different ways of doing it. We get into experiential learning. People who are sociocultural, interactive, constructivists deeply believe in the idea of learning as experiential, that you learn a concept, a word, more deeply through experience, including the aesthetic. Dewey, for instance, had a lot to say about this, so did Vygotsky. So experiential activities matter. And finally, I'll close by introducing you to something else that we'll learn a lot in this course, that is transformative teaching and transformative learning. This draws on social justice concepts, critical theory. If you've studied learning theories and philosophy of education enough, there might be some names that are popping into your head right now. Gloria Ladson-Billings, Pedro Nagura, bell hooks might be popping in your head right now as you see this term. It's the idea that one goal of education is for the learner to be transformed into a new person, and for the class, even the society, the community, to be transformed through education. That includes recognizing the need for transformation as opposed to conservation. It means naming things in society that might need to be changed, naming wrongs, naming forms of injustice. That means, as a teacher, if you're going to do transformative teaching, you need to be comfortable with naming those things. You need to be comfortable with the possible repercussions, the possible blowback that you might get from students who might not agree that these things are wrong. It's risky. Paulo Freire, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, strongly drew on transformative teaching, and of course, in turn, bell hooks drew strongly on Paulo Freire. But in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it's this reversal of the oppressor and the oppressed narrative. Because typically speaking, especially if you're talking about going back to the perennialist paradigm in instruction, what's the goal of a teacher in perennialism? It's to make sure that this culture is carried out. Classical culture, Greek culture, Roman culture, the Renaissance, on up to Shakespeare and so on and so forth. Well, what's possibly being left out? Pan-African, Latino, people of color, the stories of your Asian students in the class. What's being left out? What stories are being left out? What's the hidden culture behind this? You as a teacher are the powerful person. What are you sending there as a message by leaving out the student's culture, by leaving out that student's language, meaning making? Think about it for a moment. With transformative teaching and pedagogy of the oppressed, the student becomes the teacher becomes the learner. The student communicates, this is my family, this is my home, my culture, this is me, this is the mask that I put on in X circumstances, the performative mask, the mask that communicates my pain, and also here's the mask that communicates the real me. And it's not necessarily this skin. There's a real mask that I can artistically create that will help you understand me better, performances that I can act out that can help you understand me better. Because guess what? I am somebody. I matter. In transformative teaching, pedagogy of the oppressed, one thing that is profoundly important is to recognize that students are not just there to listen to the teacher and regurgitate information, to put little marks down on a sheet of paper or inside a computer these days and get graded on some standardized tests. Students are beautiful human beings with value and worth. Their cultures are beautiful with value and worth. And it's important to recognize that, to draw upon that as a strength, and to help that student understand that this is something that can and should be nurtured and grown, transformed in a beautiful way throughout their lives. Okay, hope you enjoyed this, and we'll talk to you later.